All right, ready to start. So we're going to talk about API versioning in Spring Framework 7. How many of you are dealing with versioning in your applications today? Okay, quite a few hands. Right, so let's get into it. It's an interesting topic because it's not something we've provided explicit support for, and it's something that we've looked into now. First of all, about me, I'm Rossen Stoyanchev on the Spring engineering team. My primary home is the Spring Framework team for many years. I'm typically involved in anything to do with web messaging, web architectures, and I'm also involved in the Spring for GraphQL project, those are the two primary things I deal with, among others. So what we want to do today is we want to do a brief sort of introduction to the topic, to do a little bit of context setting before we look at any features, and then we can try and add a little bit of perspective around this topic because it's one of the things that makes it actually difficult. And then we're going to turn and take a look at what's actually in Spring Framework 7. Well, why is API versioning important? Well, it has to do with the evolution of applications. We are going to expect that there is change, and of course, when there is change, we also need to introduce that change in some way. That's not a balance which is easy to strike, and we have to decide how frequently we iterate, and we have to decide how to ultimately manage that change. So these are important topics that that we want to be prepared for and that we want to have something in mind from the start. Now, if we try to get some common advice on the internet to ask Google, well, actual practical advice is not so easy to come by. Typically, you'll find an article that says, well, when it comes to API versioning, you can do it in the header, you can do it using a query parameter, you can use it from the path, and so on. And in the end, there's really absolutely no advice attached to that, and it leaves quite a bit open for you to try and figure out. Now, there is an article out there that you'll find. It's a bit old now, but that is Roy Fielding's opinion. In that, he basically says that you should not version. So that's on the scale of opinions, that's one opinion, and that's also something that makes it challenging to think about the topic, like how should we actually proceed when such an authoritative person, when it comes to HTTP applications, says that. Now, when you look at the details of what he's actually talking about, he says, points to the fact that when we use websites, of course, we don't see any versions in that, so why should there be any versions if you talk about REST client scenarios? Another topic that he brings up is that when we look at applications, what we should be aiming for is to evolve them in a backwards compatible manner, and that generally the idea with HTTP is that you decouple clients from servers. And he even talks about software on the scale of decades. I mean, that's a bit hard to reason, right? But he just sets the goal, the bar pretty high for that. And then another thing is to not really anticipate big breaking change from the start. I guess that's another way of saying trust in your sort of ability to evolve in a backwards compatible manner. But I think if we look at this with a somewhat critical eye, I would say that first of all, there's a big difference between browsers and machine clients. If we talk about browsers, well, there's a huge investment in browsers. Like there's constant development, browsers to be able to take instructions from the server in the form of HTML, JavaScript, and then execute that. So the server can control making change and then sending that, and the browser is capable of executing that change. And then humans come in and they adapt to the change, right? We don't always remember every single step of the sites we use. We just look at what we're presented with and say, oh, that's a new interface, this looks nice, and you just work it out from there. That's not so easy to do with machine clients, right? It's just, you can't send some data back which is missing some fields, or or you're sending something that has new required fields. So there's just no easy way to express information on that level of detail and have that be automatically absorbed by machine clients. So basically, we do need to think about how do we deal with that kind of change with machine clients. Well, the second point that he makes is to favor compatibility. I think I will actually agree with that. It's very important to set that as a first goal. But at the same time, the mileage of what you can do with that is going to vary. Because, well, I mean, there's so many different circumstances and scenarios and organizational differences and types of applications, right? There's a big difference in what some applications and domains may need to evolve versus others. So it's quite natural that in many applications that you actually don't ever run into the need for versioning. So this is important to keep in mind, because as we try to digest information and articles that are out there and advice, we also have to match that against what is the actual scenario and what is the actual situation. Even if it seems obvious, it is still a very important thing to keep in mind. Also we could say that it can be a little difficult to anticipate that from the very beginning. That's worth pointing out, because if we accept this idea that we need to version, we need to be prepared for versioning, and then do that from the beginning, then we're sort of setting up for something that may never actually even come. And usually trying to predict what's going to happen in the future, well, sometimes you may be able to do that, but most of the times you probably can't. So in terms of what you can actually do, Roy Fielding suggests that you can just use a new host name, there's a way to handle these things. And here he basically explains that we're not talking about a new version of your site, a new API version, but rather it's a new system and a new brand. I guess one way to think about it is with, for example, with car brands and car models. Sometimes, a new car model comes along and they say this is the all-new model of the car. In practice, pretty much everything in it is different, but they keep the name in order to have some continuity in the branding. So that's one way to look at it, but essentially creating a new version of the site which is distinct from the previous version. There are lots of loose associations and you can sort of work your way around, but generally we're saying this is something completely new. Now, it can be a new host or it can be new paths. This is where we get into one of the specific ways to version, which is common, which is to put the version in the path. I would say that in both of these cases, that's setting up the idea of a whole new site, something that's not in any way interlinked or intermeshed with the previous version. They're completely separate URLs or completely different host name. And there's only a loose association between the previous version and the new version. Now, this allows for very deep change. So we can pretty much change anything because the sites are unrelated. Deep entity structural changes are possible with this. By contrast, if we say, for example, choose to use a version or in a header or in a query parameter, that means that our URLs remain the same. We're talking about getting the same entities and the information for that. But in some cases, we may be doing some formatting changes, we may be doing some refinements, dropping some fields, adding some fields. And rather than changing the URLs, we can send a version separately in order to indicate what we are aiming for and what we're compatible with. And that's one way to basically manage this kind of change. And that's more lightweight change, where basically you're looking at a situation where a client for the old version and a client of the new version can both come and access the same URLs, and they're going to see the different data. And also, if they're making changes, even more importantly, that means that you have to somehow be able to support changes to the same data in two different ways from two different clients. So as I say that, it probably becomes a little bit, you can picture that this is going to have limits. Like there's only so much that you can do by introducing change in this way. But it is a very important technique because as you evolve, it is very, very common, if you get the naming wrong or other little aspects, you can refine the way your data is structured a little bit in the output JSON. Maybe the underlying entity isn't changing that much, but you decide that, based on feedback from your clients, that the data is not formatted in the most optimal way. So you decide to make some rearrangements. Having the ability to evolve in this way is very, very important because it means that you can iterate and you can make changes. That's back to how do we evolve and how do we iterate. You don't really want to sit and accumulate a lot of changes for a long period of time and then big bang, new site when you can make all the changes. So far we've looked at two different ways to version. One of them is to sort of revamp the whole thing and have no direct connection between them, allowing deep change. The other one is more lightweight change. And so we can sort of picture it on a scale, on a time scale, where we start out and we want to favor as much as possible compatibility. That should always be our main goal. And it is in itself a very big topic, right? Like there's no easy way to achieve that. Very often it depends on how willing are you to go in that direction. Sometimes it may look impossible, but we deal with such challenges also in what we do, even though it's not REST APIs that we create, but the topic of backwards compatibility change, right? Sometimes you have to spend a little bit of time willingly going in the direction of what can you do to actually try to maintain things with as little disruption as possible. And in the process of doing that, things often unravel and you begin to find ways in which it can be done and compromises that can be made and so on. And it takes a little bit of effort, but it is definitely something that is worth pursuing for as long as possible. But of course, as I said before, this is going to also vary based on the domain, based on the organization, and how change comes and how frequent it is. I mean, if you're faced with a financial application and you have to switch to using something very different like Bitcoin, we're talking now about big differences that need to be accommodated with the new version. It is very common to advice that you will find on the internet that you should version from the beginning. You should start with a version so that you can be prepared if you need to make changes. But I don't really find that very good idea. I think it is, if you don't know from the beginning where you're going to be how this is going to evolve over time, what is that scale going to look like, then the only reason to put a version is to protect yourself in case something happens, like you need to make changes. But if we have the right facilities and the right tools, if we don't feel that we're, without options, if we need to make changes, then I think it becomes, more obvious that maybe we don't need to do that from the beginning. In fact, force, a path segment, as it's common, in order to make that version 1. So we can later add a version header or add your path prefix to our URLs. That's always something that can be introduced later. And if somebody sends a request which has absolutely no version in it, we can make the assumption that that request is unversioned So that means the original version where endpoints were not versioned. And now we're getting into the topic basically of how do we actually manage versioning information in the mappings. And that's where it's a little bit more than just expressing a version. So we want the ability to do selective versioning by endpoint because as we evolve over time, initially we may have more lightweight changes here and there. So we want to be able to say, this particular endpoint needs to go to a newer version. All the other endpoints haven't changed. And over time, that process repeats itself. As we go to 1.1, only some endpoints may have 1.1. As we go to 1.2, maybe some other ones or some of the current ones changed, but the other ones didn't. So how do we deal with that is also an important question that if there's a good answer to that, then I think we can be a little more relaxed about how we manage this. Regardless of any opinions of to do versioning or not, the fact is that versioning is a very, very common practice. I mean, if you look at big websites, at cloud providers, there's a Microsoft REST guidelines that indicate where versions should be, either in the path or in a header or query parameter. There are other details, so you can take a look at that and see how they describe it. There are Google API versioning guidelines, various concrete APIs actually, GitHub, Stack Exchange. You can look at examples of how they're actually defined. Maybe we can Right. So this will be in the links from the slides. Now, turning to API versioning in Spring. So traditionally, we haven't really provided support for this. It's been a little bit off the radar, maybe because it's possible, but maybe also because it's a bit of a tricky topic. And the request that we got was actually a pretty short one. It just basically said, yeah, it's possible. Here's an article of how we can do it, but it's not as easy as it should be. So we looked at that, and the first thought was, well, there are some ways in which it can be done to make it easier by an application, but then with all the details involved in that, even if it isn't like too much what needs to be done, still to make it a first-class feature for something that's very common, that made sense. In addition, as we got into the topic, it became obvious that it's not just about providing a little bit of support, but also that allows us to target some of the nuances that I talked about so far. So what we have is on the server side, we have support. You can go into the web config for WebMVC, Spring MVC, or WebFlux, and you can configure versioning. It's not going to be supported out of the box, obviously. You have to at least indicate where your version is expected. There is no standard way to do it, so you have to configure that, but we provide convenient options to configure that, and that enables the support. Then you can begin to express version information on your request mappings, and there are a variety of strategies that you can use to control this in more detail. So let's take a look at an example. So just to understand, first of all, a little bit about the application. It's a very, very simple application with accounts and statements and a couple of repositories, which are just basically very simple in-memory repositories initialized with some hard-coded data. And then we have a very simple controller. So this is an account controller, and we can get an account by ID. That's one endpoint. And then we have a statements controller. And that is also one specific endpoint. So we're starting out without anything in our web config with those two endpoints. Right, that's empty, and I'll start the server. Okay, so that's up and running, and now if we do localhost 8080 and go to accounts 1, no, 99 I think. Okay, so we just, very simple, we get that back. Now we're going to go ahead and enable versioning. And for that, we can just implement a method. That's the versioning method. And on this configurer, we can add, okay, so among the options of what we can do is we can say we want to do that through a header. Let's say XAPI version, and this enables versioning, and now we will be expecting that to work, to be in effect. So if I restart, okay, everything still works because I'm sending unversioned request, and that's coming to an endpoint which is not versioned. Now I'm going to go to the accounts controller first, and I'm going to add another one of these. Actually, here's another endpoint. It's exactly the same, but this one has version 1.1. We'll start out with that, and it's exactly the same basically, but let's imagine that we're returning a slightly different account. And I'll restart this. And now if we go there, we get a bad request, and it says the API version is required. So now we need a version. So we're going to repeat this and say X API version is 1. Okay, now it says invalid API version 1. So what happens is that it's looking for the version to be a known supported version. At the moment, in the mappings, we've listed version 1.1. But we don't really have any concept of a version 1, right? And there's no way to automatically know what the versioning is like. So one option would be to put the version here. If we want to make that a version 1, let's call that a version 1, then we will say version 1. And now if we restart, and this time it works, and we can verify with the server-side mapping that this was mapped to the getAccount method, which is the version 1. But if we have many endpoints and we don't want to have this version 1 everywhere, then basically we can take it out of here, and we can go to the web config, and we can say supported version, that's version 1. Yeah, so the idea here is that in the configuration centrally, I can add the supported versions, but if something is already present in a controller, in the mappings, I don't need to add it, because that's already present and we know about it, so that's one of the supported versions. So now we should be able to target version 1 as well. Version 1, that works. And version 1.1 works. And we can see the different controller methods here, the 1.1. And if we try version 1.2, then we get a bad request because that's not a known version. So that's generally sort of the experience that we want to make sure that you're submitting the right versions. I will mention also that if you don't want this to be automatically derived, the list of versions, then you can also say supported versions, set supported versions. I'm not seeing it here. There is an option, maybe I'm not on the right version. That's the fun of using snapshots. But there is a way, and it's very much the intent that you can actually set the supported versions to a fixed instead of being discovered from the mappings. That's the general idea. Okay, so now let's take a look at the next step. We're going to add another endpoint on the side of the other statement there. Let's do a 1.5 here. Right, so, well, 1.2. Let's go in sequence. 1.2. Okay, now we're releasing version 1.2. One of the endpoints changed, but the account controller, that didn't change. That's still as it was before. That version 1.1, nothing changed. It's still good for version 1.2. But if we go to the same endpoint and say version 1.2, that says invalid API version. Hold on a second. I didn't restart, I think. Yeah, 1.2. Statements? Oh yeah, statements, right. The right URL. Right, so we go accounts, statements, I think it was. Accounts, ID, right, and then statements. Right, so that 1.2 works. The 1.1, what happens with the 1? So 1.2 gives us the method which is 1.2. If we go to 1.1, it basically goes to the baseline one because that's the highest, right? Below 1.2, that's the one that we should find. Now back to the accounts, actually. The account endpoint, if we do a 1.1, that works fine. If we do a 1.2, it says that's an invalid version. Why does it say that? Is because there is no endpoint, right? We have below 1.1 and we have 1.1. So there is nothing here for 1.2. That's a strict match. So what we can do here is there is this little baseline syntax that we can use in order to express that this endpoint is good for 1.1 and higher until there is another, you know, if I then go here, let's say by version 1.5, I add a 1.5, then that would be a different story, right? Like now at 1.5 and higher, there's a higher version endpoint, but until then, 1.1 is unchanged. So now if we restart this, and if we go for 1.2, and that works, and that came from the method for 1.1. So basically it's a range at that point, an open range. Right, so this gives you an idea of how we sort of manage these versions with the mappings. And as you evolve with the application, you can use this, and it's configured centrally, so that means that you can decide separately whether it's a header, whether it's a query parameter. Now, the next thing that I want to show you is how you can switch to path-based versioning. So for that, I'm going to switch out the web config. Just copy this over to the web config. We'll get rid of the request header. Okay, so let's focus on the first part. So if we want to use the path, then we're going to use the option for path segment, and then we can indicate, as is common, to put the path segment. It's the first path segment basically where we expect to see it. And now for all of our controller mappings, we also want that to be a URI variable, but this we can do either on the controllers, or if we don't want to repeat that everywhere, then we can do it centrally with the path match configurer. So this is an option that you might not have come across, but this has been in the WebMVC config and in the webflux for a while, where you can go and you can externally configure a prefix for all of your controller mappings, and actually there is a predicate here which gives you the controller class, and from that you can decide should you apply this path prefix or not. You can work based on the package, you can work based on the specific class, or you can just return true and that will apply the prefix to every single controller. So now we've configured everything like that, and we can simply restart. Okay, so now as we send this again, we no longer need the header. That's not what we're doing. Instead, we're going to add the version in the path. So that came back, and it was mapped to the get account. We can also go version 1.1. That came back, and that's the get account 1.1, so that's going to the right place. And we can just check 1.2 as well. And that also went to the 1.1 because that's the highest version up until 1.2. So yeah, so you can see that it's possible to switch to a path-based prefix. It's actually all externalized configuration, and then the versions are managed in the way that I've shown. Okay, so this actually sets up to talk a little bit about the actual versions. So in this case, we're using what looks like semantic versions, right? We have the 1.1, 1.2. So by default, these come as strings, and we parse them, and that's parsed into a semantic version type, which has a major, minor, patch. Which means that you can work with all three, or you can work with just one or two. And let's say if you do 1.2, that's the same as 1.2.0. Or if you do just one, that's the same as 1.0.0. And that means that you can choose to have only major versions, or major and a minor, or yeah, if it makes sense, you can also include a patch version too. You can also customize this parsing, and that's the next thing that I'm going to show, which is over here. Right. Okay, so what this one is, we're customizing the parser. And what we're trying to do is, this is something that exists in the Microsoft REST API. So one of the things they expect is, if you have your versions 1, 1.1, 1.2, you can also create these, what they call groups, and they're groupings of these versions by date. So if you had 3 versions released within a certain period of time, then you can say, at 2024 12/31, the highest version is 1.1, so you can send the date, or you can send actual version numbers. And it's essentially like mappings between dates and versions, so that maybe clients, it's easier for them to remember based on a date what corresponds to what they're working with. So in order to achieve this, there's the semantic API version parser. That's the one we have out of the box, and you can and that's used. But in this case, we're going to extend it, and we're going to, if the version that's coming in looks like a date, then we're going to expect that to be in our map. So this maps to 1.1, this maps to 1.2. And if we send a version which doesn't match, then we complain about it. Otherwise, we can parse the version as usual. So that means you can send either 1.1 or the date, and both of these will work. So that's just a little example of customizing how the version is actually sent. Okay, so that, there are more things to see on the server side in terms of customizations. You can actually create your own version. You can use a request param. You can use path segment, header. You can do required versions and supported versions, so that's a good one. So by default, we expect the version to be present, and that's required, but you can turn this off and you can say the version is not required, in which case we will return the highest version. But if you want to set a default version, you can also do that, and then you can say what the default version is, and now if you send a request without a version, then you can choose to set that to the lowest version or any other version. You can set up your own parser, and you can also set up your own version resolver. So if the path query or segment is not something that meets your needs, you want to do something in addition, then you can actually plug in your own version resolver, and that's a very, very simple type, which is just a simple, here's the request, what is the version in that. Okay, now we do have support on the client side as well, so I'll give you a quick, let me just go back to the web config and switch back to just a simple header version. Okay, so now in the client package, and I'll make this available, we can, okay, if we run this app, yeah, it should complain that we don't have a header. Bad request. Invalid API version account. Oh, we probably need to restart because it's still on the path-based version. Right. Oh, the server. Okay, rerun this. Okay, so now API version is required. Yes. So let's go ahead and add the API version. So on the client side, on the client builder, we're going to do an API version inserter, and in this case, we're going to use a header. This API version inserter gives us a few options there. So we'll use the API version header, and we'll specify the API version here. So now we can run it again. Somebody did the build. Okay, 404. I think this is the ID. Okay, that worked better. And yeah, we got the account back. and on the server side, it's the account 1.1, so this looks fine. At the same time, we can also do this with HTTP services. So if we have an exchange, HTTP exchange interface, we can do 1.1, and then for the for the underlying client, we have to configure it so similar, but just coming down from the interface as a version. So we have this for the web client, we have this for the REST client, and it's also supported at the level above in HTTP exchange interfaces. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little bit of testing support as well. Okay, so there's a few different kinds of tests here. This first one is a test that will load the application context, so the versioning is configured in that. So with the tests, there's actually two things, right? One is we want to make sure that the server-side versioning is configured. If we're loading the application context of the application, then that's automatic. But then for the actual test, for the sending the request, we want to make sure that there's a version. Now, if we're using the web test client, this is straightforward because web test client looks just like REST client or web client, and so the experience with that is similar. You can see here that we're setting the API version, and that's being passed. But also, what we want to make sure is that the test client, web test client builder is configured with the strategy to use, where should the version be inserted. And for that, we can use a web test client builder customizer. So we get access to the builder, and then we can write as many methods as we want, passing the version, and that version gets included. And I should have mentioned that both with REST client and web test client, you can use a default version as well, default API version, so you can set that from a single place as well at the builder level. So these things are available as options. The next one is a context test. And here we're using MockMvc tester. How many are using the new MockMvc tester, relatively new? So this is great. I mean, if you're using MockMvc, right, that's a kind of static import style API where you have to use a static import to make the fluent methods work. MockMvc tester is a more recent sort of version of that, which gives you a fluent interface, and it gives you a CertJ support, so it's really quite a nice experience all around. And that I would recommend that you use nowadays, sort of as a fluent interface alternative to MockMvc, and you can see the outcome looks like this. So that's quite nice. So now, if whether we're using MockMvc or MockMvc tester, it's a pretty similar idea. We're getting it inserted here. We're specifying the version, but we need to make sure that we also configure in MockMvc how to insert a version. So there's quite a difference between this and the previous example. In the previous example, web test client is an actual client which talks to a server, whether that's a standalone server or not. There's a distinct client. With MockMvc, it's all server-side testing. So server, as we have to make the request from mock HTTP request and response. And that we do on the MockMvc builder, essentially, to say when there's a request, then insert versions in this way. And then the final one is a slice test. So slice tests are more lightweight tests that focus on one controller at a time. That can be done with the MockMvc tester as well. And you can see an example of it here. It's basically the same hook, which is MockMvc. These are just different ways to use MockMvc. And that's what we have for now. There are a few demos here. couple of demos, and also we have by now reference documentation, so you can take a look at that. I will make the slides available, so then you'll be able to actually follow the links and find these. That's pretty much all I have to show for today. Are there any questions I can answer? Everything's clear? Yeah. Can you speak a little bit louder? Deprecation. So the question is about deprecation headers? Yeah. Yes? Okay. Yeah, so that's one of the topics that isn't addressed yet, but it is something that's common requirement. I've come across it now multiple times, so I think we still have milestones where we can add that. It's definitely on the, in our eyesight, but creating an issue for it, I think would be also useful, and providing feedback on how it should work, right? That's, there's a few ways that we can make it work, and it would have to be configured by the application, basically, because the details of that depend on how you want it to appear. So we have a mic now, if anybody wants to ask a question. There's a hand back there, on the right.
Oh, thanks. Please don't choose someone on the left next. Oh, there's microphones everywhere now.
Right? Yeah. Thanks, Rossen.
Yeah.
That was a great talk. So I have a couple of questions. First of all, the usage of a string in the version annotation attribute is inherently not type safe, right? So the assumption of the version as the value of the annotation attribute is that the person would use there, like most of the time, the value that corresponds to semantic version, right? So the major version, the minor, the patch.
Yep.
Yes. Would be there any kind of ways, have you considered any other ways of expressing the semantic version in a more type-safe way and in a more explicit way? Because currently, nothing stops me from printing any like garbage value in the version, and apart from that, it will not be clear to what semantic version it will be applied. For instance, if I put inside the version attribute just number 1, it implicitly means the 1 as the major version, 0 for the minor, and 0 for the patch. Yes. Maybe the better solution would be to provide multiple attributes to the annotation that corresponds to numbers, for instance, and you will make it explicit that you are using the semantic versioning, and the versions of the minor, the patch, and the merger will be also explicit, right? Any kind of thoughts to make it a little bit more type safe if you are committed to semantic versioning?
I don't know if committed to semantic versioning is the right way to express the way I look at it. Is more that semantic versioning is a common technique. We want to make sure that that works, but at the end of the day, what's coming in the request is going to be strings, and they're not going to be typed, and we need to apply some kind of so we need to parse that. At the same time, for the mappings, I do think that once the default options are used, it's something that you get used to quite quickly, what the syntax which is expected is, the application will not start if you put some random string in it. So that's something that you're going to get feedback on pretty quickly. It's not going to go unnoticed in any kind. And we're trying to go for a little bit of brevity, right, and expressiveness. With multiple attributes, I think it's going to get longer, and then the names of those attributes. So it becomes a slightly different thing. And then what if you know, that's not the versioning that you use. What if you use dates or something different? So we want to provide helpfulness, but at the same time, we do want to keep it flexible. Okay, one more question.
Maybe a shorter question than that last one. Or maybe not.
I hope it will be short. So thank you for great speech, and yeah, it's really nice to have it. But one just short question: will Open API documentation generation include this versioning also?
REST API documentation, you mean?
Yes, like if I have Swagger.
Okay. Yeah. So you know, with Open API, there are ways to generate a version. We've created an issue at Open API to provide support for that. You know, we're still sort of making available what we have, and documentation was just added recently. So we're going to continue to work on that to make sure that that's supported. So if you put the version in Open API, that can generate the mappings with the version. But yeah, I mean, in terms of generating REST documentation, that would come through, you know, things like Swagger, right? So it should follow from there, I think. Okay, well, if there's anything else, please come after, and thank you very much.